Welcome to Freelance Sucks. Here we discuss the dark side of freelancing about which nobody usually talks out loud. In this show, we speak with experienced freelancers, and I'm sure listening to their stories helps you prepare for freelancers' challenges. My name is Yuri. I'm a contributor at Code Control and 9am.works, and my guest is Mike Bal, an experienced product leader with over a decade of thriving at the intersection of technology, strategy, and innovation, who's been doing freelance work for a long time, sometimes in between full-time roles and sometimes in parallel. So welcome, Mike.
Thanks for having me, Yuri.
Let's start with the first question. What is the most challenging part of being a freelancer for you?
It's either finding clients or dealing with clients. And I want to say dealing with clients on the human level, not the project work, but dealing with the clients themselves is probably the hardest part.
What do you mean by saying that?
So the project stuff is easy for me, right? Like there's a thing that needs to get done. I'm good at doing the thing. I can jump in and do it. The hard part is like, this is a new company you're working with. It's new people you've never worked with before. They may or may not know how to get this thing done, right? Like, you know, in your head inherently how to execute this. They may not be prepared for it. They might not know what to expect in terms of like what you're going to need, how often you're going to need their attention. It's like teaching them and engaging with them and kind of warming up the relationship is a little bit more like draining on the, well, mental and emotional side, really. Like, I can't just go heads down and knock it out and be done. You have to do some education. You have to do some relationship building. So I think the part of it there is like making sure I do that is sometimes hard, right? Like it's easy to just go, but making sure you do that is how you get more business and how you make them feel good about the engagement. And it's also doing that is somewhat draining because it's not, everybody's like, oh, I freelance because I'm good at this thing. They don't expect how much time, or they don't always anticipate how much time goes into relationship management and customer relationship management, right? So I think that's the other part of like, you have to know and remind yourself like that requires time. It's important. And I need to factor that in, like give myself the headspace to do that specifically. And it's just hard to balance when you're trying to find clients and get your projects done on time and all that other stuff.
When you are starting working with a new project, with a new client, what is your approach to building relationships?
Yeah, so when we're just kicking something off, and usually in the sales process, I kind of get like, who am I going to be talking to the most? Who's my day-to-day contact? How do you work? What's going to be, I'm flexible. I've used every tool. I've used every communication method. I can do daily. I can do weekly. Like, what's going to be best for you? And I try to get in a good cadence. And then I just really pay attention to when we're kicking things off of how they respond and react to it. Because they maybe said, oh, weekly is fine. But then they're asking every day or every other day about progress or something like that, right? Because somebody else is bothering them or whatever. So I just try to tune into that early on so that we get in a groove. Because I think the way to make it take less time and less brain power is get in a really good cadence so it's always there. Like the best clients and teams that I've worked with, like we have our daily stand-up or we have our weekly sync. Things are updated, ready. The client's already looked at the information. When we get on the call, we're talking about big items or new items, whatever, and we're moving on. The worst ones are the ones that feel the most awkward are like, where are we at with this? What happened? Did this thing get done? Did you see this email? Did you see this like new ticket? And it's all over the place. So I think it's really getting in a good groove and setting a good foundation for just like how the machine works.
You told before that when you are joining a new project, it doesn't always like that way that everyone is on the same page, on the same level of knowledge. How do you teach people you're working with, but in a way that you are not, like teach them? I mean,
yeah. I really fell in love with, I don't know if you use Loom, but screen shares and video recording, because when I'm giving like demos are already part of a process most of the time, even when I don't do like design work or web work or whatever, something to show. Even when I'm documenting, sometimes I'll hop on and record the video and I'll show them how the document is structured and I'll teach them why I did it that way. Like I'll explain and narrate it. Because some, there's visual learners, auditory learners, there's learners who just process the information as they read or whatever. And there's people who learn by doing. So if I have all those elements, right, like I need them to go in here and do it, I show them what I need them to do. If I have information I need them to read, I explain which section has which and emphasize like which points. And it's usually 5 minutes, right? And then they have a video they can go back and reference when it's convenient. And that's another deliverable I put on there. So like training materials, guidance, whatever. So it kind of just works in multiple ways. And it's easy for me to give them that reference because I think I've been most frustrated when I'm like, we just talked about this last week. I just walked you through every single thing that you're asking me about right now. Like, why didn't we have questions then? Or why are we redoing this?
How do you deal with such people?
I just call them on it. I'm pretty honest. Like I'll usually give like a little bit of room the first time, be like, hey, we talked about this on the call last week. There should be a recording somewhere. If you want to go through it, but here's a quick answer to your question. If it keeps happening, I'll be like, okay, and now I need to charge you because what I'm going to do is record a library of these things or document these things so that you have a reference point and we're not spending our stand-ups every single time doing it. Or we're going to increase our call times and I'm going to bill you for those too because you just need more help. And sometimes I talk to the higher ups where it's like your team needs more handholding and it takes my time. And they usually understand that, right? They're like, yeah, you're giving us a ton of information, a ton of valuable stuff. Our team needs to level up. If you're willing to be the one that does that, great. And maybe you just add a little bit of budget onto it, add hours or whatever, depending on how you bill.
Sometimes it happens that when you are joining a team and there are people who are working full time, they might feel a little bit of danger out of freelancers because like this person will do the thing, like maybe they are more experienced than me. And yeah, sometimes they can get a little bit of defensive, like, yeah, it's
Yep.
not that way. Yeah, you are doing it wrong, etc. So how do you deal with people who are getting defensive?
Yeah, I usually try to look at it and I try to start by peeling those layers back early on. So when I introduce myself to the team, I'm like, if I were on a call or something, be like, here's what I understand I'm here to do. Here's what I think you guys are going to do. Is that right? Like, is that how you understand it? And sometimes it's a little awkward in that first conversation. Like, it's very direct, like a very American way to approach it, right? Is like the most obvious, blatant, like, are we on the same page with this? And I always toss in things like, and I understand that maybe you are interested in doing this and learning more about this. And these are some of the questions when I'm working with an external team and jumping in, I'll ask the boss or the manager or whoever is like leading it to be like, what does your team want to get out of this? Like you're bringing me in to help get this done, but what do they want? Like, what do they feel like they need? Does their perception align with yours? And that way I can go into and be like, oh, the developer is having a hard time understanding the requirements. They're not getting far enough. Like they have high level requirements. There's a whole space in the middle. So then I'll put some time with the developer and be like, what format do you want this in? Like, is this helpful? Do you want to give me some feedback on this first thing? Like, can I change it for you? Or if it's a designer who like doesn't want me to come in and just steamroll the whole UX piece of it, like, hey, let's work together on this. Let's hop on a workshop this week. Here's how I'm thinking about it, but I'll even toss out like I'm struggling with this. Do you have any ideas, right? And that way it's open and it's collaborative. And when I present, when I'm demoing or anything like that, it's never something I did. If there's an external team, like, so and so helped me with this. I was sat down with so and so. We worked through this. They came up with this great idea. Because at the end of the day, if that whole team feels good about working with you, they're going to go back to the manager and be like, yeah, it was a great experience. Bring him back again, hire him if you can, whatever. If the manager loves your output and the entire team hated it and feels threatened, you're not coming back.
Yeah. Yeah. What is the most time consuming thing you must deal with as a freelancer except for work itself?
Sales. I think the back and forth on scoping, and this gets tricky too, because I encourage people to charge for discovery, right? But there's a number of projects that aren't complex enough to justify it, or you don't know you need to charge for discovery until you have some discovery done already.
Yeah.
It's like that upfront information gathering, planning, and then getting the right proposal with the right number on it is a huge time sink up front. And when you get into revising it and all that stuff, that can drag on too. So you thought you had a project that was going to start in 2 weeks, and in 6 weeks you're still working on the final version to get it approved through legal or whatever, right? Like that's probably the hardest part, and I think the most time consuming.
How do you sell to a client a discovery part?
I think generally saying like, I'll give you an example right now. If I wanted to automate a sales proposal process, okay? And every industry is a little bit different. Every company, honestly, is a little bit different. And I say like, hey, I know how I would do this. I've actually built something that would do this generally for any industry. For your specific business, here's what I need to know. And the best way for me to get that information is to fly out, sit down with your team and actually go on a couple of visits with them and work through this process. That will be that will save, let's say, 6 to 8 weeks of time building this thing out, and it will save probably X $1,000 or X 100 hours or whatever it ends up being for figuring it out on the way and reworking things. It's generally one of those, like, if you have the money and budget set aside for it anyway, like put the money in up front to get it done right, and the rest of it will go much smoother. And if they don't, then it's like your timeline and your budget increase as a result of that, period. Like, it has to happen either way, or we're going to build the wrong thing. And I absolutely, like, I can build the wrong thing. I've done it in the past and I've learned from it, and nobody's happy with it, right? Like, it's a waste of money. It's not like, it doesn't work. So I refuse to do that at this point. So I basically, if they're stubborn about that, I'd be like, you have to work with somebody else. Somebody who's willing to just blindly build something, right? Like,
yeah, I feel like when you're building something blindly, as you've told, there are a lot of added hours, a lot of added work, and at the end of the day, the project that you might have planned would take, I don't know, 1 month, ends up having 6 months or something like that, and then you pay just 6 times more, kind of. So yeah, but still,
the funniest thing to me is, like, if you ever work with like on a simple, like what should be a simple landing page, and you ever work with design, the back and forth between content design cracks me up, because of like what content needs to be on the page, and the content person's like, well, I have a bunch of content, but what's the page going to look like? I can tweak the content to the design. Like, how are we going to lay this stuff out? And it's back and forth for I don't know how long, but I'm always like, oh God, here's a starting, like and it's every company. I don't know why it happens this way, but landing pages are the worst in that case.
Yeah, because everyone kind of can tweak, and everyone doesn't want to do extra work. So basically, they want someone to be responsible for the ongoing process. So, what is the most nerve-wracking thing that you must deal with as a freelancer?
I think the hard, nerve-wracking, stressful conversations are like things aren't going well, and worse if the client's bringing it up, right? Like, clients giving you feedback, they don't feel good about the project, they're on the verge of canceling it, something like that. Like, that's like when you're getting feedback about what you've done, especially if you feel like you're doing your best or trying your best. Those are probably the most nerve-wracking. Or if you're working on something, it's not going well, it's falling behind, and you have to deliver the bad news. But either way, that conversation of like, this isn't going well, we're missing budget, we're missing timeline, like we have a problem that's going to be expensive to solve or hard to solve or whatever. Those are definitely probably the most nerve-wracking.
How do you deliver hard news?
With a lot of caffeine. I think it's usually a case of, and I when I worked at 10up, the agency was really good about this, of like, have we done everything we can on our end to understand the problem, to figure out a solution, to come up with a recommendation, and to own our part of it to a fault, I will say, because when we were there, like, and the founder is just this way, but we would just own the cost of whatever we did wrong. If we could say that it was, even if we didn't do it wrong, if it was something we could have done better. And this was extreme. Like, I would never do this myself right now, but it's one of those cases of like, you go into it saying like, okay, here's where things have gone wrong. Here's the point where this broke or we went the wrong direction. Here's what I could have done to get us in the right direction. Here's what your team could have done to keep us or go in the right direction. Here's how we need to solve it, and here's what that means. And generally, when I go into that, I have a prepared set of ideas or options of like, option A is we just add X weeks onto the engagement and the launch timeline, and I eat the cost. Or option B is, I can bring in somebody externally to solve this problem because you don't have the talent in-house. That is going to cost more money, kind of thing. And like, but it'll keep us on time. Option C is whatever. And I just try to go into it with that so that they can talk through it. And I try to just really prep myself, like, know what you did wrong so that you don't get defensive, because that's the worst thing you can do. And then you end up in a battle, right? If you can just own it openly, it goes so much smoother.
And what do you do to prevent such kind of situations?
I think it's anxiety is probably the best preventer of these. Or like when you're planning a project or working on something or taking it up front, like your communication, the second something feels off, the second something feels like it should be moving faster than it is, or, like, I hate to do this because it sounds micromanaging, but if I'm like, hey, this developer said it was a 1 day task or whatever. We're 3 days in. They said they've got one thing to finish up. I haven't seen anything. Then I saw something that said it's going to be a huge PR. Like it's a pretty small task. It was supposed to be like 1 day's worth of work, and now it's a huge PR. Like something is not right here. And even if all that happened within 1 week, I'll escalate it. I'll be like, this might be nothing. It might just be more complicated. I haven't had that communicated to me. I usually call it my spidey sense, Spider-Man, right? Like
Yeah.
my spidey sense is going off. Something is not right here. Let's get ahead of that, because then it's not a big surprise. The worst is if it's like, oh, this has been going on for 4 weeks and we're like now 6 months behind schedule because nothing got done and everybody's blocked. Like that's the worst. So I just kind of like, we'll call it spidey sense. It's a bit of anxiety. It's a lot of experience of like, what are the things I should be vigilant about and how do I get ahead of them, right? Like maybe if I can just solve the problem myself, I will. And I'll communicate like, this was a potential risk. Here's how we mitigated it. And even if I'm not sure what the impact is, I'll be like, this may slow us down or push a couple things in the next sprint or whatever, right? Like it might not, we might be able to get ahead of it, but it might. That way the client, whenever they're looking at reports, whatever, they have that in their head of like, oh, he's on it, it got ahead. We might be slowed down a little bit. They're setting the right expectations on their end too.
As a freelancer, do you ever feel professional loneliness?
I do. Well, no, I don't personally. I have 4 kids and they
Yeah.
homeschool, and I'm
Lonely.
very rarely alone. Yeah. And we have dogs and cats and pigs. Like I'm never really by myself. And even when I'm plugged in, I think the time that I get to work on it is the time that I really cherish, like be focused and heads down. But I do understand too, if you don't have a big family and you don't have a bunch of animals around, and you're just working with clients and even like embedded in a team that's not very social or active, right? Like teams that are fully remote are much better at socializing and engaging asynchronously. If you're working with a team that's in person and you're like the odd one out on a different computer in a different country or whatever, like you do feel lonely and you feel left out. And there's kind of this like that adds to some of the dread of like bad projects too, to me.
Mm.
And probably as a filter we didn't talk about that I would factor into whether or not I want to work for that company. If it's like the whole team is in person, whatever, and I'm just like some guy in the left wing that they keep forgetting about, like that's not a good place to be in.
Yeah, totally. If your friend wanted to become a freelancer, what are top 3 things you'd advise them to consider before doing it?
I would say before they do it, figure out what they're best at. Arguably and undeniably, like what are you best at that you could say, you show up and this is the thing you want to be doing, like you're engaged, you're really good at it, whatever, and then like go through and figure out the business value on it and know all of these things, like how you're going to position yourself, how you're going to differentiate, what kind of work you want, who you want to get that work from before you tell anybody you're taking any kind of work, right? Like know yourself, know your business, know what you want to do, and figure out what that value is. Because the worst thing you can do is start and undersell yourself and then have a bunch of the wrong customers paying not enough for really high value work that you just weren't sure how to sell. So if you've never done it before, learning about the business, like the basic business stuff, like don't go get your MBA, don't overdo it. Just learn about like, what does a sales process mean? What does a pipeline mean? How do I do some of these basic things? Like, how do I make sure the customer is happy? Just read some blog posts, listen to podcasts, right? Get a good sense of how that business actually works in practice. Then once you know how to talk about yourself, then start moving into, okay, how do I get my first customers? And I wouldn't even market or broadcast big, right? Like start with your network, start with people you've worked with, start with clients that you've had at previous companies, start with companies that you're friends with or whatever, and see if you can find a few things or people that are interested in it. And this is just like with product, like you have an idea, you go talk to the people who would be the customer and validate that it's a problem we're solving before you build it, right? This is the same thing.
Mike, I wish to have the sky's the limit, but time is the limit. So the final question, if you were starting freelancing today, what is one thing you would have done differently?
I might actually try to productize some of my services. I actually had this fleeting thought the other day of like, instead of it being the whole process where I discover and scope and do these bigger projects, I might try to package it into like, if you have this need, I will do this thing in this way. I have a buddy who did this with messaging, and he sells 6-week messaging sprints, and like it kind of seems ridiculous in some ways, but it's a thing. It's solid. It's consistent. That's how he does it. There's a lot of value in just doing that. And then you get people on board with the value of that and how it works. And you've done it so many times that you gain efficiencies and your margins go up. The like custom, I'll figure out how to do this thing for you because you have money, I don't think is the place that like I don't like to spend my time in anymore. So there's different models that I take on. Not that I wouldn't do kind of custom consulting, but I think if I were to actually try to scale it out and build like a big pipeline for myself, I think I would productize what I actually want to do. Like right now, maybe it'd be prompt engineering, right? Like if you want to use AI and you can't get something value out of it, like come to me and I'll do this in X amount of days for X amount of money.
Got it. Mike, thank you so much for sharing your experience and for having such an open conversation.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime. Thanks for having me, Yuri.
And thank you so much for listening. If you like the show, hit the like button, 5 stars, and share it with your friend. That's it. We're done. See you in the next episode.